I'm Deb Lavoie, and I am here with Janine Zacharia. Janine Zacharia is the Carlos Kelly McClatchy Lecturer in Stanford's Department of Communications. She teaches journalism courses there, and she also does a lot of research and writing on the intersection between technology, media, and national security. We met because of a really interesting paper that she wrote with another author on guidelines to help newsrooms report more effectively on disinformation. So I thought we could talk about that a little bit today, but then also she's got some really interesting new research that she's starting to set up on how we reconstruct trust in the media in the post-Trump world. So Janine, hi, thanks for joining me today.
Hi, Deb. Thanks so much. It's such a pleasure to be here and to know that so many people are really interested to listen and learn about this topic.
Yeah, there's a lot of interest in this topic. It's kind of top of mind for a lot of people. So first, let me ask you a couple of just sort of basic background questions. One is that you started out as a foreign correspondent focusing on the Middle East. And you held some really high leadership positions in that role. What made you switch from sort of foreign policy, foreign affairs reporting to tech, media, and national security?
So so most of my career I spent as a beat reporter. I was focused on the Middle East. I was based in Jerusalem for about 7 years for different news outlets. My last job was as the Washington Post Jerusalem bureau chief, where I traveled around the Middle East, and I spent 4 years as the State Department correspondent for Bloomberg News, mostly during President George W. Bush era, a little bit with Secretary Clinton. I traveled, and right around the time of the Arab Spring in 2011, for personal reasons, I had to move to the Bay Area. So I ended up having to shift my focus naturally, and I started teaching journalism at Stanford. And along the way, I got very interested in this intersection of technology and national security. And where I live, all of these, tech platforms and whatnot are shaping the way we live, right? And so I've been writing about the threats posed by Facebook really since 2012, when I was concerned at that time about how terrorists were hijacking these platforms to recruit people. And so I was already, very concerned back then, and even before that probably, but really around 2012. And so over the last several years now, I've been getting steadily more involved in that intersection that you described, taking me up to the last 2 years, where I've been part at Stanford of a working group on information warfare. And out of that came the report that I can talk about if you'd like.
Yeah, let's spend a little bit of time on that. And then you also told me that you have this new project coming up that I think is going to be extremely, extremely interesting. So the title of the report that I first saw, which drove me to get in touch with you, was, it's a really good title, How to Responsibly Report on Hacks and Disinformation, 10 Guidelines and a Template for Every Newsroom. The guidelines are very interesting because a few things. One is that it recognizes that journalists are people, and that journalists, credible journalists, have already norms that they follow.
Exactly.
Talk to me about sort of what inspired this particular report in this format, and what you learned in building it.
Yeah, so myself as a longtime journalist, I partnered with Andy Grotto, who was President Obama's and briefly President Trump's cybersecurity guru in the White House. And we're in this working group together, and I'm saying none of this is going to get fixed, this disinformation threat, unless we deal with the norms of the credible fact-based news, that media organizations, that's how I like to refer to them. And I can't control every wacko media organization out on the web, but I can maybe have some influence in the majors, okay? And I think there's an argument to be made that even though people say, well, these legacy media organizations don't have the same heft that they used to, because everything's so dispersed and everybody's on social media and everybody reads their own thing, they still can have influence. So for example, when the AP decides that we're going to capitalize Black as an adjective for a Black person, most people followed suit right away. And that was a very quick decision. So what they do matters. So Andy and I went, but what motivated me was a very deep fear that in 2020, we would have a repeat of 2016, when the legacy media, the mainstream media really failed when it came after the DNC was hacked by the Russians, right? And if people will recall, all that reporting about Hillary Clinton's speeches and what was the content of the emails and John Podesta's risotto recipe, her chief of staff, and all this stuff. They were focused on the content. They got totally used by Russian hackers. And so in the run up to the election in 2016.
So say a minute for what do you mean when you say they got totally used? Say a little bit more about what you mean by that.
What I mean is that they weren't, even though we had reporting back in June 2016 from the Washington Post and others that the Russians were behind the hack of the DNC emails. If you look at the coverage of what was hacked, and they released WikiLeaks, people will remember there were all these emails from the DNC and Hillary Clinton staffers. There was little to no mention of the fact that this was a Russian disinformation campaign designed to undermine Hillary Clinton. They were so focused on the content and that they missed the fact that they were being played by a foreign enemy that was trying to undermine our democracy. Okay. So for me, the story at that time was not what was in the emails. It was why someone was hacking her emails. What was the purpose of the hack? What was the motivation? What was the provenance of the material? And so that was something that I wanted to make sure that the real news organizations, the credible ones at least, would focus on and understand going into 2020 in case it would happen again. Because guess what? It worked. It helped in 2016. The dump of the WikiLeaks emails on October 7th of 2016, people might remember this 1-2 punch of the Access Hollywood tape of Trump on the bus. And they were, it came right after that. Okay. So Andy and I went in February of this year, earlier, right before COVID set in. And we went to New York and DC, and we met with the top editors at the AP and the New York Times and the Washington Post and NPR and NBC News with a rough out of our guidelines, and we got their feedback. And exactly like you said, Deborah, there's norms for credible fact-based news organizations that don't exist in other media, which we can talk about. But this is such a new area of disinformation and hacking and fakeness and all that the news organizations haven't really come up with norms. So that's what we tried to do with our guidelines.
So for people who don't necessarily know what we're referring to when we say there are norms in journalism,
right?
One of the examples that comes to mind is that there are established norms and practices around acts of terrorism, right? And how those get reported.
I'm thinking something very more general, okay? So for example, if you're a credible fact-based news organization and you make a mistake, you run a correction, okay? Mm-hmm. And there's a place to find those corrections, and you explain how the correction happened, right? If you're a credible fact-based news organization, you have certain sourcing protocols that you go through when you talk to people that you're interviewing, right? Are we on the record? Are we off the record, which means you can't use it? Are we on background where I can quote you, but I have to come up with some kind of a explainer?
Sources say.
A senior official who declined to be identified because he wasn't authorized to speak. And you explain that to the reader. If you are a credible fact-based news organization and you use that kind of sourcing, you have to get permission from an editor. You need to talk about why you need that, because it's actually in the public interest, right? And so there's a certain set of ways that you construct your reporting, and you don't show the whole story, for example, to the person that you interviewed. Okay, you can read back quotes. This is not written in a constitution. It's not written in a set of rules that govern, say, like the finance industry, but these are sort of understood norms within the industry. Whereas when you had a Russian hack of the DNC emails, it was a kind of a free-for-all. People didn't know what to do, which is why we came up with these set of guidelines.
Okay, great. Do you want to do a little bit of a quick overview of what these guidelines are and why they matter?
Yeah, I think so. And I think it's for people really what it is, it's about what do you do? How do you report on lies? Okay. It's really, it's something, or something that is meant to, that has a political agenda. So people who are interested in news consumers should be looking for this when they have something like this. So like we can think about the context of the, before I get to the actual guidelines, of what happened with Hunter Biden's laptop right before the election. We already, maybe people forgot, but there was this story that went in the New York Post about Hunter Biden's laptop. And if you think about how that story played out, when I'm going through some of these guidelines, it actually, I was very happy because I think people didn't be like, oh, what's in the laptop? They were like, the laptop was where? They were very skeptical about the provenance of the material or what, like the source of it. Okay. They weren't as interested about what was on the laptop. So that story didn't take off. Okay. And
that was a very big difference between what happened at the beginning and what happened at the end. And it was a very meaningful shift.
Oh yeah. I mean, look, the DNC emails was a much bigger hack, much more sophisticated, but the Hunter Biden story they tried to run the same play there, whoever they is in this case, and it didn't work. And I think part of it is that the newsrooms were sensitized in 2020 in a way that they weren't in 2016. So
there was a noticeable pause between the time that news broke and the time any major news organization, any reputable news organization would even comment on it. And I thought that was unusual as well, because they were out there checking out what was happening.
Yeah, no, people, and how they reported on it ultimately was interesting. They wrote about the why, the story behind it, who was pushing this story, as opposed to, oh, what was on the laptop that ended up with the Delaware repairman. I mean, the story was so cockamamie anyway, so it was a little bit more straightforward. It wasn't that newsworthy. And what I'm saying, by the way, is that, reporters are going to report things that are newsworthy. It's a matter of, your focus and how you do it, because the job, what are we doing here at the end of the day as journalists, right? We're trying to convey to people what's important to be an informed citizen in a democracy. Okay. It's not about gotcha journal. It's about, if you're really a good journalist, you want to make sure that viewers and readers understand, make sense of the world. We're not here to transcribe, we're not here to be played by Russians. Like, we want to explain to you what's happening. Okay. And so along those lines, one of the things that's made that more difficult in a way is social media. Okay. So many of the people on this Facebook Live chat may follow journalists on Twitter. All right. And some days I wake up and ask myself, why are journalists tweeting? Why are they even tweeting? What is the point of this? Why I can see using social media as a tool to find sources and whatnot. But what happens too often is reporters with large followings just tweet stuff out. They just tweet it out. So what I was worried about is that we'd have some disinformation campaign or hack and leak, and then reporters would just start tweeting, as opposed to let your readers know we're working on a story about this and we'll get back to you. But this pressure to be first on Twitter is overwhelming. So the first thing
you called it a prisoner's dilemma. I thought that was
yes.
Right.
That was my partner, Andy. He was very into the prisoner's dilemma analogy, but if we don't do it, they're going to do it, trying to game it out. So we just said, develop social media guidelines for your newsroom. Okay. And that was the first thing, right? I mean, one of the things that drives me crazy, and we're like, how many days left in the Trump era? You still have, when President Trump speaks, you have reporters live tweeting him, right? So you have them basically, he says something and they tweet it out. This is like 5 years into this. So you're amplifying whatever lie or BS he's saying, as opposed to saying, if you must live tweet it, then you've got to say without evidence or, contrary to all facts, or why he's saying this, to try and undermine the credibility of Biden's victory, so that drives me crazy. Remember, second, that you're an adversary that people are targeting. This is happening to journalists now. It's not only the Russians, people want journalists to amplify their stories, and very often they're not true, or they may be partially true. And then it goes on and on with a lot of these other recommendations that people can read. But the two things really, focusing on the why of a disinformation campaign, as opposed to what's in the campaign. And then news organizations in 2020 really need to build their muscle on this front. And I know this is an area that you're, Deborah. I mean, it's sort of like, there's so much going on that's fake, that's lie, that's partially true, that's meant to make you crazy. Like, we need journalists to be trained in how to figure out what's really trending naturally, what's being amplified by bots, like stuff that's more sophisticated. And I think newsrooms are starting to do that.
Yeah, I think so too. I think that your work and the work of others has definitely raised the bar for journalism, and as evidenced by their much more sophisticated response to the laptop story than stories in any part of the stories in really 2016, 2017, 2018. There was a lot of nonsense that happened there. And of course, right now, there's quite a lot of disinformation in the zone, one might say even more than ever, and some of it is incredibly pernicious. But the mainstream reporting is a lot more responsible in terms of not just parroting it, but contextualizing it and recognizing it for what it is. So I want to move, because earlier today, you told me that you had a new project that you were embarking on, and it was very exciting to me because it's very near and dear to my heart, which is how do we start to reconstruct trust in media? How do we start to reconstruct a national narrative where we may all have different opinions, but we sort of recognize generally what's true? And we saved sort of the bulk of that conversation for now. So what motivated this, and where do you see it going as a starting point?
Yeah, well, so I sort of want to build on what Andy and I did with our report, because, by the way, what was thrilling about the report was the Washington Post editor-in-chief, Marty Barron, adopted the guidelines. He circulated into the newsroom, said, this is our policy. And that led to media coverage of that. And so a lot of people, I feel like, I know within the major newsrooms that we were able to have an impact. But now,
well, just one sec. We will post the link to that report. That report is very clear. It's really insightful. Even as a non-journalist, I thought it was extremely, I learned a lot from that report in terms of understanding the challenges that journalism faces, and some of your guidelines are super practical.
Well, that was what we tried to do. We tried to make a flow chart, and for people, it's very short. And we wrote the intro for people who are not journalists to kind of just understand, okay, what's going on inside a newsroom? Why is this a problem? Why is this hard? So anybody who's interested in that should check it out.
So we'll post that link because it's really interesting. Great.
So for me, why I haven't been able to sleep for the past 5 years, pretty much, a lot of reasons I haven't been able to sleep. But I see the damage that President Trump has done to the media, right? And for 5 years, he's been hammering hundreds of times on credible fact-based media, calling them the enemy of the people, worse than that even, to the point now where I worry whether we'll even be able to restore respect for credible fact-based news. And if we can't do that, how do we function as a democracy, right? If the media are no longer a trusted source. Now, you might say to me, well, Janine, there's a lot of institutions that aren't trusted anymore. The government's not trusted. There's no trust in anything right now. But my objective, and the objective of a lot of people that we know, Deb, I think, is in this area. So it's a bit of a crowded field, actually. There's people working on different parts of this. But for me, I look at the results of the election, and I see that more than 70 million people still voted for President Trump, even though he lied more than 20,000 times during his presidency, and countless other things. Okay, so why is that? Why are so many people? I'm worried, right? How are we going to? And part of it for me is we're never going to get out of this kind of zone where it's okay to have a president that lies that many times, and you sort of follow him no matter what, unless we do something about the news media environment. Our media ecosystem is broken. That's my bottom line, right? So right now you've got, this is not a advanced point in any way, right? Half the country pretty much watching Fox News, now Newsmax, One American News Network. They think that this is real news, right? Or they think this is real news. Fox News in legal battles has actually defined itself as an entertainment channel. Okay. It's not, and there's a difference between the daytime programming and the nighttime programming.
Just briefly talk about what is the difference between entertainment and news.
Right. Well, right now, one of the problems is that, people say to me, well, what do you want me to do, Janine? You want me to sit around and watch CNN all day? No. Because cable news has become, think of it as like talk radio on TV, right? You're driving in your car, you're listening, and you're hearing people yelling, and there's a lot of opinion. It's kind of like, you get your heart racing, like you're thinking about it, right? But that's not a healthy news diet. If you wanna watch your Maddow or your Lou Dobbs or your whatever, your Brian Williams, you got to get your meat and potatoes and your veggies first, okay? If you're vegetarian,
So in other words, what those people are doing is not reporting the news; they are sharing their opinions.
How many opinions can I have on cable news at night? It's only opinion. It's so many opinions.
Right.
Every night I put it on, I'm like, oh my God, it's all opinion. So
they don't worry. So, they have, let's just say, varying levels of commitment to making sure what they're saying is based in fact. And they justify that by calling it entertainment instead of news, right?
Yeah. I mean, Sean Hannity literally said on the air the other night, I don't vet the material that I say.
I saw
Can
that.
you imagine? If anybody watching here, if you were a real journalist, do you know what the scariest thing is? Having to run a correction, getting it wrong, because my whole credibility, my whole life rests on that. Who's going to talk to me if I got something wrong? And he went on air and said, I don't vet this material, So anyway, my point is people like watching these shows, whether you're on the left or the right, but you got to know what you're watching. With all the amazing investigative reporting that the New York Times did on his tax returns, unbelievable. David Fahrenthold at the Washington Post with his accountability journalism of Trump. Half the country didn't read it, okay? Or half the country, maybe they said, oh, that's just fake news because Trump said fake news so many times. They are watching Fox News, determining what's important. And for them, in the run up to the election, what was the biggest story? The Hunter Biden thing, right?
So I want to drop in a stat here.
Yeah.
At Reality Team, we're very focused on the fact that there is so much disinformation. Disinformation is super simplistic and it gets into people's heads. And we're not necessarily focused on those people who are deeply indoctrinated in alternate realities. We're focused on people who are confused. And according to Pew Research, that's over 50% of the adult population says that it is harder to discern what's true from what's not true. And as we are doing sort of focus groups on these things and doing more research on these things, we're finding that very few people read beyond the headlines. And that is a major cause of the problem. And when what they're watching is these sort of people pontificating and giving their opinions and going off on rants, that is really not the same thing as reading the report itself. And most of that opinion, whether it's on the left or on the right, is actually distorting what's actually in the report. And I don't know that people understand that. They're looking for those other people to interpret that information for them. And that's part of the problem. Anyway, sorry. So
no, I think this is the problem. You summed it up very well. There's the way we consume news like this, like if everybody's scrolling, this is not a good way this is not good. It's not built for it. When Mark Zuckerberg said after the 2016 election, he wants to get out of news, you know what? He's right. In a way, like it's better. You want to share pictures of your kids and your dogs and whatever and your recipes, like go to, but like actually trying to read news, scrolling, getting aggravated because it's a for-profit mechanism that's meant to grab your attention and like make you aggravated. Like you're not going to be an informed citizen reading that. You're only going to read what your crazy uncles are posting or whatever. You want to be smart. It's not that hard. We just have to teach people now where to go. and we've also got to meet people where they are. So the counter argument to what I said is we have to give them, like you're doing, Deb, good stuff to scroll through. If that's where they're going to be, if they're not going to take the time to read a real newspaper or so we have to think of creative solutions for how to reach people with credible fact-based information. We need to teach them about this. Yes, they're all fighting for your attention. Be more skeptical about headlines. Read the first paragraph at least, I mean, when I teach my students at Stanford, it's the top 3-4 paragraphs. You got to nail it, right? Because maybe we can get them to read that far. But I think, yeah, go ahead.
Just one of the other problems that I'm hearing a lot about is exactly where I know you're going here, which is that the people, and I'm going to use my son as an example because he's always my canonical example here, because he's 21, he's super smart. He does not read newspapers. He's just not interested. He gets most of his information secondhand. And when he asks me a question, when he challenges me on a thing, his next question is, well, what's the difference between your story and their story? Why is yours correct? So what you're talking about, this connection to facts and vetting, and you called it the fact-based media, right? Mm-hmm. It's not, these things are not, they're not equivalent, right? They're not balanced. They're not the same thing. Mm-hmm. People don't know the difference, and we need to teach them that, right?
Yeah, no, I mean, like I said earlier to you, Deb, like one of the things I really want to do is create I need your help from your team, right? Because I'm just a journalist, researcher out here at Stanford. I'm not I got my student kids, not my real kids, to help me, but I want to do a pithy little video that says InfoWars and the Wall Street Journal are not the same thing. Let me explain to you why they're different, what the standards are of an InfoWars or One America News Network. So,
great idea.
I mean, it's just, I would be better if I was in my class. I would call up examples of this. But, one thing that comes to mind is we had these wildfires out here over in August, September. People might remember in the West. I mean, California it was crazy out here. And a reporter with 250,000 followers on Twitter for One American News Network tweeted something out with a map, okay, that showed the fire stopping at the edge of the US border with Canada and made it seem like it was a conspiracy. Oh, yeah. Oh, there just happened to be stopping at the US border. This got so much engagement, thousands of likes and retweets. It was just a US map. They didn't show the Canadian data, right? And so if I'm a reporter and I tweet out BS like that, or if I report something like that, there's consequences for me. Probably get fired from a real news organization, right? Doing something like that. Nothing happens to that reporter at One American News Network, So I think teaching people, if you're watching a One American News Network now, or InfoWars, or, Newsmax is pushing this new right-wing thing, pushing an alternative reality about the election results. Alternative reality, it's just not rooted in reality. It's your thing, right? What's your thing called? Reality, right? So anyway.
Right, we're totally nonpartisan. It's just that it's hard to be complete. It's one of the challenges we have because one party has decided that reality is not as important to them as the other, which is
yeah. So I think
that breaks everything.
One of my theses, and one of the things should I talk about a little bit about what I want to do now, what I'm working on?
Yes, absolutely.
Anybody who's interested in this can get in touch with me. I'm at Zacharia at stanford.edu. I would love to talk to people, especially in the battleground states, about this. But we have so much work to do to undo the damage of enemy of the people and fake news, right? The canards that President Trump pushed. First, people need to understand that if a journalist makes a mistake, that doesn't make them fake. Okay, it's very basic. People make mistakes. You make mistakes, viewers on Facebook Live, right? You don't have a formal way to make a correction, but you know what I mean? It wasn't meant to, they're not making stuff up. There's a difference, okay? Just to get that out there.
One is an intent to deceive, and one is an intent not to deceive.
Intent. Okay, I don't want to deceive. Exactly. So All right. So, but basically, one of the reasons I think that his canards have taken hold, right? This idea that the news is fake, that the journalists are, that I'm an enemy of the people, okay, is that people don't know journalists anymore, right? And this relates to the real crisis in our industry, which you and I will be familiar with, Deb, and maybe some viewers, but in local news, okay? So, when I was growing up in New York, and I wanted to work at the San Jose Mercury News or like one of these amazing papers, which are like basically on life support now, right? And when 15 years ago, the San Jose Mercury, 20 years ago, the San Jose Mercury News would have had a reporter where I live, right? Redwood City reporter, a Palo Alto reporter, a Menlo Park reporter. They would have been at every council meeting and school board meetings and everything. Now there's like one person covering this entire area between San Francisco and San Jose, right? In terms of like, so you don't have that interaction with local journalists. So it's easier to demonize someone in any field. We know this from psychology if you don't know someone, right? You see this with immigrants and things like that too. So how do we deal with that? So I think we need to reconnect communities with local reporters. We also need to make credible fact-based news available to people. So right now, if you're living in Pennsylvania and you want to, or even if you're in the Bay Area and you want to go to the San Francisco Chronicle, you're going to hit the paywall if you don't subscribe. And people think that things should be free, and they're not inclined to pay for news anymore. They don't understand what goes into that, right? I mean, I subscribe to like 20 things, but this is what I do and I believe in it. Not everybody's where I'm at, right? Hardly. So what happens if we go to a place like Lucerne, Pennsylvania? This is my first idea, which is a county that went for Obama and then Trump and then stuck with Trump, okay? And say we give everybody a subscription to the Scranton paper or the Philadelphia Inquirer paper, digital, whatever, and they just have it and they're exposed to it. Maybe we engage with them in surveys along the way to see what they know or think about the media. Maybe along the way, we do meetups with local journalists from those newspapers, which is my second idea. What I want to do at scale is dispatch like hundreds of journalists, local ones, to their communities and say, talk to me, tell me your ideas. What are your story ideas? What's worrying you? What are you seeing in your local community that I don't know? This has the benefit of people getting to ask questions about how journalism works, seeing that they're not enemies of the people, and actually building that trust, right? So I think phase one of giving people access to the information, supporting local news organizations, and engagement with real journalists, I'm wondering whether that can help. Like those are the two main things I want to do. And then I have a third one, but I don't know if Deb, do you have thoughts on what I'm saying in terms of these ideas?
Oh, yeah. So first of all, I think it's fantastic. And I think that people should, I think it's a great idea to get people engaged in that news. And I'm imagining that the thing that's going to get them more than the newspaper itself is the daily update that those newspapers are going to send out. Like the, top headlines this morning email that people get. Right. And I'm also wondering if the Philadelphia Inquirer or the Scranton, whatever it is, doesn't also learn a lot about that community itself and building that relationship between the journalists and the community, which used to be there but isn't anymore. I think that relationship will be super interesting. I also think that those papers are going to probably have to realize that they're going to need, as we were saying earlier, to meet those people where they are, which might not be in the habit of reading a newspaper.
Right.
But that's going to be valuable for both parties as well, learning what will make how do we make the news something that is relevant, interesting, meaningful for people? How do we rebuild that relationship between the journalists who report on the world to us and us who need to trust those journalists? I think that's fascinating. And I think that is a hefty chunk of the credibility, the trust gap in journalism. Yeah. So I love the idea.
Yeah, no, and I'm going to look for funding, and I've got ideas, and I think it has to be a sustained engagement. The problem is, like, a lot of these news organizations are decimated, right? They just don't have the bandwidth, the manpower, and whatever. But I think assuming we can get the funding and do it, I also think that my thesis is that from what I did in my disinformation working group that I was talking about earlier, this information warfare group, that the trusted interlocutor is going to be somebody within your peer group. Okay, so I can't, as a woman from Long Island, now teaching at Stanford, parachute into Wyoming and do this meetup. Okay, it's going to have to be a reporter who's grew up in Wyoming, is like those people.
Mm-hmm.
It's the way people are talking about right now, the anti-vax issue, right? So if you're, I can't go into the anti-vax community in Marin County, just north of where I live, and say, get your kids vaccinated, right? It has to be an anti-vax mom who, like, from their peer group, who saw the light and then says to them, here's why I changed. If we're going to, I think. So, it's funny though, I had a student last quarter he's from Kansas. And I said to him, Chris, I said, can you go do one of these meetups for me in Kansas? And we'll do a practice run that I want, because I want to try it out, like, beta test it. And he said, Janine, I don't know. I'm from, one of the Democratic counties, the one Democrat county in Kansas. So they might not accept me. Grew up in Kansas, right? But my grandparents were from Wichita. So maybe that will make it acceptable. You know what I mean? Like, so I think we have to be sophisticated in who we dispatch and how we go about it. Plus we have COVID right now, and I really want to do it in person with everything that's good on Zoom, but I really want this to be in person. So I don't know if I can do it right away.
Yeah, well, I think we have much to discuss in terms of, in terms of what we're working on as a team. We got a few things going on that I think intersect with this. One is understanding where on the spectrum people are from generally reality-based, fact-based people who generally can tell the difference between real and not real,
Mm-hmm.
and people who have completely lost the thread, right? People who have given over their natural instincts for reason and rationality to someone else. There's a range there. There's a spectrum, and understanding how to talk to different people at different parts of that spectrum, understanding who's vulnerable on that spectrum, like how do people go from being more or less reality based to being confused to getting indoctrinated, because the other team, the bad guys, it's not just disinformation, right? They're not just pumping out disinformation. They are actively recruiting people to engage them and actively recruit them into their way of thinking. And some of these things are super devious, including starting out with pictures of puppies and stuff. My mother-in-law sent my teenager these really cool links from the Epic Times, right? And I lost it, right? And everybody was like, maybe you need to calm down. I was like, you don't understand. So understanding where people are on that spectrum, understanding who the vulnerable people are, who's most vulnerable to disinformation, and understanding how to have those conversations. It's not exactly the same problem, but how do we create trust where there currently isn't trust is a hard problem.
Oh yeah, no, it's totally related. And a lot of the people I've been thinking about interviewing and bringing into consultations for my project are people who have worked on de-radicalization of people who left terrorist groups, people who came out of cults, I mean, I'm not drawing an equivalence, but once you are in a certain mindset that you believe a certain worldview, then you come out of it. There's a process there, and so I think we can learn.
Those are analogies, right? And I think that there's a lot to learn from that.
Yeah,
I agree.
So it's just it's a very overwhelming problem, and so I'm probably going to end up having just to bite off part of it. But I think we need to work very hard on this. And it may be that a certain group of people are no longer reachable. And then we get to like my colleagues at Stanford who are working on media literacy and making sure that younger generations coming up can process. And, it's very hard to navigate online information. It is. the whole point is people are trying to dupe you, whether it's with a certain URL, I mean, there's all kinds of research now that shows that people are not good at this, whether you're 18 or you're 65. So we need to make that a core part of our curriculum.
Oh, absolutely. I want to point out that what we're seeing in our research is that most people who think that they're smart and think that they're educated think that they are immune to the problems of disinformation, and they're not. One of the things that we're starting to publish is our gotcha stories, like the stories of this is the piece of disinformation that got me last week.
Yeah.
And we study this all day long, and we still get fooled. So we want to collect those stories as a way to show people that it happens to all of us, because disinformation is super devious, but you can learn to get better at spotting it.
Yeah.
So that's as part of your, I want to talk to your kids at Stanford too.
Yeah, no,
figure that out.
It's definitely wonderful, because it shouldn't be embarrassed about it. It just happens, I mean, it's
right.
It's happening to everybody. People can look at the work of my colleague Sam Weinberg at the School of Education at Stanford, who's put out a lot of research on this. That's everybody gets fooled. Stanford kids, Stanford professors, like all of it. I can send you a link to that, Deb. But
yeah,
one more thing I wanted to talk about that's been on my mind for a long time now, but it's even more urgent, is the class I teach at Stanford. I teach an undergraduate class and a graduate class. My core classes I teach are reporting and writing skills, news reporting and writing. And it used to be that, okay, it's a seminar, I teach 15 kids every quarter and they go off into the world. Some of them become journalists. I'm very proud of them. But, and it never used to matter pre-Trump. Like, I thought if Americans understood, or anybody around the world really understood how journalism works, this is not something I thought was a priority. Now I think it's a huge priority. I think it's urgent. I need to explain what I teach, the things I referred to earlier, like how do journalists come up with stories? What is news? How do they write a lead? How do they do an interview? How do they find those people? How do they verify information? How do they run a correction if they get it wrong? How do they, you know what I mean? Like, all that, I'm wondering if we, show how the sausage is made, which usually journalists don't like doing that. If that could help, right?
Oh, I think so very much. All through this conversation, I've been thinking the thing that gets people do not understand the difference between credible fact-based journalism and not credible fact-based journalism. And when we try to identify, well, this outlet is or isn't credible journalism, there ends up being this sort of bizarre little argument that happens well, that's just bias and opinion. And we need to help people understand that, sure, there is bias and opinion, but that's not the same thing as being fact-based versus not fact-based. So I actually want to enlist you to help create some really simple tools that just sort of say, this is what fact-based journalism looks like.
Yeah, no, and I've broken it into 10 skills, and I want to, I had this idea that I wanted to have like, an actor or somebody, like do these little quick videos. All right, lesson 1 of credible fact-based news, and then you show the difference. Okay, if you're a conspiracy website versus a real, this is what happens when you're like interviewing someone, right? This is what happens when you're talking to an editor, or maybe you don't even have an editor if you're at a conspiracy site, you're just writing it. So there's so much to do on that front now, and I
can do this.
I hope so, but will it matter? Will it impact people? Or so people so far gone to be like, you want me to read the New York Times, that liberal rag that, like whatever people are saying,
So here's the thing. As I say, this more than 52% of adults are in this confused space, right? That means they are not yet gone. And those are the people I think we need to help feel more confident, feel like they do understand the difference. So what we're seeing is that people who live in this state of, I'm not sure, end up not trusting anyone because they think that everyone has an agenda, and they don't know how to tell the difference, right?
Yeah.
What is the difference? They don't know. So I'll also mention that, so we ran this experiment, right? Where we bought ads on Facebook,
Mm-hmm.
and we targeted them at people who didn't read news in different age categories. And we sent them our little cards, our little reality cards. You've seen them.
Mm-hmm.
And our engagement on those cards was ridiculous. It was huge.
Yeah, it's great.
And regardless of whether or not our cards are perfect or anything like that, it showed that there is at least, especially amongst young 16 to 25 and older, weirdly 60 and up, there's actually a lot of appetite for that. So I think that if we do it right, and we do it thoughtfully and we bring those resources together,
Mm-hmm.
there is an appetite for that. People don't want to be confused. People do want to know, but they don't want to read a 10,000 word article to have to do that. That's too much heavy lifting for them, because these guys are living their lives, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what you're doing to help understand how journalism is getting twigged, how it's getting jerked around, what you did to sort of help journalists deal with that effectively. Now moving on to, so why is this relationship between journalism and its readers kind of broken? And how do we fix that? That's such a smart progression. And I think that's kind of where there's so much opportunity, because people want that. People want to be able to feel that they can tell the difference.
Mm-hmm.
So I think your work is gonna be really helpful there. So as we get to sort of the end of this conversation, what do you want people to think about? So the people who are watching this conversation, what should they be thinking about? What kind of questions should they be asking? What should they demand of the media they engage with?
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, let's start with what I think they should demand of themselves. Okay. Are you, person watching this, gonna just be a passive scroller? Are you just gonna like scroll? Is that gonna be what you're gonna do to get your information? Or are you gonna make a choice to, as you choose maybe to eat healthy or exercise X number of minutes every day, to make sure that you get credible fact-based news in your diet every day? And if you're gonna do that, how are you gonna do that? Okay, so maybe you're one of the 52% that you mentioned, Deb, that you're confused, you don't know. Let me give you a few suggestions. If you have some allergic reaction to the New York Times or the Washington Post for some reason, you just think they're liberal, whatever, I don't know, then go to the AP, okay? Go to Yahoo News and search for AP, because Yahoo News, they filter a lot of AP stories. Google News is a little harder to get the AP. Or go to the AP website, and pull some headlines. Get the feed on your phone, get the AP and scroll that, just the AP. And just read that for a little while. Just read those stories. You can set it that you want to read the US news, the world news, but you will know that that is straight up reporting, okay? They may have some news analysis there too, but you're not going to have a lot of talking heads, and you're not going to have clickbaity headlines that are meant to just draw you in and make you crazy, okay? Do that. Second, like look for nonprofit news organizations more than for-profit. So one of the problems we have is that cable news, and even some of the legacy news organizations are fighting for clicks and for attention. They need to make money. A lot of newspapers, mid-level ones, are owned by hedge funds, and they have to meet certain profit margins, and so that affects their ability to say, just give you the news that you need to be informed, right? They gotta really.
So who are some of these nonprofit news organizations that?
So for example, I mean, you could go to, I have to find the website, but there's an association of nonprofit news, which I can give you to put in the link. And you can search by your area that you live and read one of those and kick them $10 a month or something like that. Like I do with San Jose Spotlight, which is a nonprofit news organization in my area, where you've got people who are really just trying to create something new and fresh. hyper local news that will be interesting to you, but you don't have any of this corporate craziness, right? That you have to. So nonprofit news, I mean, I am a huge fan of public radio. I just love public radio. I love Judy Woodruff and PBS NewsHour. Now, I know not every 21-year-old is going to sit and watch Judy Woodruff, but like, if you want to get like a good news program, that's it. It's really good. Now, I'm not saying there's not other good stuff on the other channels. There is. But, you know, listen to public radio. I mean, it could be, I mean, out here we have different options, right? KQED, KLW, whatever. I mean, wherever you are, it's just not true. I mean, there are holes in coverage, and maybe there are certain biases of certain things, and maybe you don't like something, all right? But there's a way for you to express your opinion to these news organizations, have it heard. You can pitch story ideas. It's another thing you can do. You can write to a journalist when you hear something that upsets you and have a conversation with them. I promise you, if you write an email that's thoughtful and kind, and you say, "Dear Deb, I listened to your story on NPR. I have a question about why you only interviewed X kind, people on this. I was upset that you didn't include voices of blah, blah, blah. Or I was confused why you didn't do da, 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 da." You know what I mean? Like that's what used to happen before the internet, before social media. I would get emails from people and they would like tell me, or, they would write letters before that. You can engage, right? Don't just get upset and say, "Oh, it's all biased." So, and read carefully and read over time, because you may read one story and you think, "Oh, it's biased liberal rag or whatever," or read it over time. Okay. And see, and be smart about it. So sometimes when I did a thing the other night for some Stanford faculty, and very famous kind of people were talking about how they don't like, and I called up a story. I said, let's go through it. Let's read the headline. Let's read the lead, the first paragraph. Let's see, do you really think there's too much opinion here? Do you understand that this is a news analysis as opposed to news? That's another thing that's happened, is when you read like this, you don't understand like what's news, what's an analysis piece, what's an opinion piece. It's all flat, right?
Whereas so what's the difference
yeah,
what's the difference between a news piece, a news analysis piece, and an opinion piece?
Yeah. Okay. So here it goes. So when you're reading a news story, you're going to find it in the A section, in the front section, or it should be in the news homepage of your website that you're going to read or whatever. And you're going to look for a straight kind of reported story with the top two paragraphs telling you who, what, where, when, why, okay, what is the story about and why do I care? Okay, which you'll find in something called a nut graph. Okay, that's another norm type of thing, telling you why the reader should care. Why is this significant? So, for example, when Gavin Newsom selects whoever's going to replace Kamala Harris as a senator from California, there's going to be a straight news story explaining who he picked. Okay. Now, there may be a news analysis written that day that talks about why he picked her, what were the kinds of pressures he was under, where he's being criticized, sort of talking about all that calculation. It'll be a little more analytical. There might be a little more attitude in that piece because you already know that he picked her. Okay. So they don't need, this is a little bit more like interpretive. It's a little more interpretive. You may think it's a little too much opinion, but it's more of an analysis. Okay. Here's what he was going through. And then you might have in the opinion section, someone from whatever interest group writing like, "This was a disaster that he did this. You're certainly going to have that, right? Because you only pick one person, right? So you'll have an opinion from someone who's like, "Here's why this was a bad decision." You're not going to find that in the analysis. That's going to be an opinion. Okay. He should have picked a Black woman. He should have picked a Latino. He should have picked, because this is why. All right. And that person makes an argument. Now, and you may not like that. You may not like that argument. Okay. Well, so, okay. So you didn't like it. All right. So you read it. I mean, we have to get back to this time, Deb, too, where you read things that challenge you, not reality versus fake. Like, read something about immigration or Social Security reform or farm subsidies or solar energy or whatever that challenges you, but that's written from a real news organization. So if you normally read the New York Times, read the Wall Street Journal editorial page sometimes. Vice versa. You know what I mean? So take control. Like, don't think, "Oh, it's all a mess on the internet. I don't know what to believe." That's a cop out. You got to take control. And then there are great sources out there. We live in this ironic period, right, where people are saying it's so hard to figure out what to read, but we have unprecedented access to information. If I want to read about Nigeria right now, I can go find a paper in Nigeria and get the lowdown what's happening in Lagos like this second. Okay, we take that.
There's quite a lot of news happening in Papua New Guinea right now that I only know because my husband has work in Papua New Guinea, but they're replacing their prime minister. And you know that in a flash, even though it's so far away. So, you know, I think that your idea of reestablishing a relationship between people and journalism, encouraging people to sort of understand the difference between journalism, opinion, and whatever that sort of infotainment stuff is super, super important. And then, you know, reminding people or letting people know, like my parents, I remember my mom talking about writing a letter to the editor. I can't remember the last time anyone I know ever said anything about writing a letter to the editor, but these are things that are definitely available. I want to wrap up because we're at the top of the hour. So any last thoughts? And then I'm going to share out some things for people to follow up with.
No, I think I'm good. I really appreciate the time to talk to everyone, and I hope I get to hear from a couple of you. zacharia@stanford.edu is my email. You can send me feedback, positive or negative, but don't make it mean, make it, you know, constructive. That's the way you want to talk to journalists, you know. I liked what you said about this. I was curious about this though. So
well, thank you for all that. We will, when we post this video, we will post the your contact information, the links to that paper, how to get in touch with you, and maybe we will also collaborate on some of this, some of these materials around how journalism works, and see if we can do that.
We'll be in touch.
I really enjoy talking to you. I learn a lot every time I talk to you, and I love the different parts of this problem that you bring together. So thanks for spending this time, and we'll chat soon.
Take care.